Alright, class, welcome to our lesson on the Abolitionist Movement. So, earlier on today in our U.S. history class, assuming that everything went according to schedule, we should have made it through our discussions of the nullification crisis and the origins of America's Christian fundamentalist movements. Now, if so, this is going to be very simple for you to understand. If not, well, you'll have to wait till we finish up what was supposed to be today's lesson, and maybe this will make more sense to you. But in the meantime, the Abolitionist Movement. So what is the Abolitionist Movement? The Abolitionist Movement is a moral and political movement within the United States, the British Empire, and other nations to abolish the institution of slavery. Now note, the unity within the Abolitionist Movement is kind of a difficult subject to cope with. In one breath, while there was a certain sense of cosmopolitanity in the movement, wherein some speakers would move from the American areas of the abolitionist movement over to Britain and then back. For example, Frederick Douglass did a tour of Britain and Ireland during his time as a major speaker in the abolitionist movement. However, there was not one large international organization working towards the end of slavery. Rather, there were different abolitionist societies within different nations, and in many cases there were multiple abolitionist societies within a single nation. So, what are the roots of abolitionism? Because slavery has been around at least as long as human warfare, and race-based slavery at least as long as Portuguese expeditions in Africa. So why is it that when we're looking at this time scale of, if we're talking about slavery in general, we're talking about over 3,000, 4,000 years of human history. And in the case of race-based slavery, we're talking about up to this point, at least a good 400 years of human history. Why exactly is it only now? Well, it's closer to 300 than 400, but still. Why now do we suddenly see a movement for the abolition of slavery? Well, one answer is Enlightenment ideas. Right, so during the Enlightenment, there's all these notions of human equality and the illegitimacy of hierarchical systems based upon blood and birth, which makes slavery harder to justify. If you're in an ancient or a medieval society where you have a stratification where some people are just born superior in society to others, it's easier to justify a system where certain people are at the very bottom and are considered practically subhuman and property, whereas there are others at the top that enjoy almost semi-divine status, right? Think about ancient Rome, where your emperors got deified upon their death. Then you had your patricians, who were your wealthy landed class, your plebeians, who were kind of everybody else, and then at the very bottom, you had your slaves, right? In that kind of system, it's easy because people are seen as being legitimately, legally born better or worse than others. But in a system such as we start to see developing in the revolutionary republics of the United States and France, that's harder to justify, right? Think about some of these sentiments we start to see expressed. And while, yes, the Declaration of Independence is purely a sentimental document, it's not legally binding in any way, shape, or form, it does speak to a mindset that's starting to develop, right? Think about this line: we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, right? Self-evident, which is a kind of an 18th century way of saying obvious. It shouldn't have to be pointed out. Or when the French did in their Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinctions may be founded only upon the general good. So coming from that perspective, this is a harder reality to justify. So we start to see a movement like, well, maybe this isn't okay. Moving onward with this notion, we also see in the 1800s and 19th century the beginning of more Christian religious fundamentalism begins to spark. And the fundamentalist movement, as we already discussed, is kind of a mixed bag of nuts regarding good and bad causes and consequences, as we discussed today in class. However, one thing is there's a renewed focus on biblical scripture and taking said scripture literally. Now, again, this is a double-edged sword, as we're going to get into later. But these people are now kind of renewed, they're set on fire with a sort of zeal, and there's a move to try to change their societies, both British and American, to reflect biblical laws and morals as they saw them. And so suddenly, issues like this suddenly start to take on a new kind of importance in this age. It also is a matter of that makes things important to understand is that at this period in time, most people who are enslaved have already been Christianized. So the older idea that existed in the past, where it was illicit for a Christian to own another Christian as a slave, there's still a little bit of that hanging around. It's not as hard of a fast rule as it was in the Middle Ages, but now the notion that, oh, well, you're Christianizing them is not as clear when most people that are enslaved have already been Christianized or descendants of folks who have been enslaved several generations previous. So we're in that stage at this point when we reach the 19th century. So now let's talk about our prominent abolitionists. These are the four you're going to really need to remember for the regions. Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Beecher Stowe, and William Lloyd Garrison. I'm not going to go into too much detail about any of them right now, because we're going to go into detail about them in just a little bit. So, let's start with Sojourner Truth. She was enslaved actually all the way up in Ulster County, New York. I've already told you where Ulster County is, about 2 hours north of where you're at. Now, prior to the abolition of slavery there, so as you know, most of you are used to thinking of New York as a free state. It does become one, but not at that point in history. So slavery was legal in New York for a good deal of its history as a colony, and for a small portion of its history as a state in the Republic. Now, eventually, Sojourner Truth, she escapes slavery. Eventually, the Van Wagners, who are a family that she came to befriend, helped her secure her freedom, bought her freedom. And after that, she actually later went on to file a lawsuit for the return of her son from her former owner, who had been sold illegally into Alabama. So when New York announced the end of slavery, New York did a moratorium first. They kind of said, look, slavery is going to be made illegal at such and such a date in the future. You have so many months, you'll kind of be aware. This was kind of seen as a courtesy to slave owners. If your business depended on slave labor, probably a good idea to start getting some affairs in order to figure out what you're going to do now that this is no longer legal. However, many slave owners took this opportunity to try and sell enslaved persons that they owned south. Some people call this selling them downriver. This is also part of the origin of the expression selling someone down the river. This is where that comes from. And it basically is literally they were selling them south where slavery was still legal. Now, in this case, Sojourner Truth was able to get her son back. She later became a close associate of William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass. She worked as an itinerant preacher for a while, so she and the man she eventually married were very closely involved with new fundamentalist movements in the Baptist Church and Methodist Church were getting started, and she eventually became part of these religious revivals, which were a big event. And she would later go around preaching scripture and would later also go around giving speeches on the evils of slavery. In her later life, she would also become a champion of women's rights, civil rights, and the temperance movement. Now, let's talk about Frederick Douglass. Now, Frederick Douglass is our next major figure we're going to look at. He was born into slavery in Maryland sometime around 1818. Due to the nature of record keeping at this time, his exact date of birth is not known. He was actually taught the alphabet by the wife of his owner's brother-in-law. And later on, he taught himself to read based on the alphabet that he learned. He later escaped north, moved to Massachusetts, and yet there he began giving speaking tours and wrote 3 autobiographies. He was an associate of William Lloyd Garrison, Sojourner Truth, and later on Abraham Lincoln, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Ulysses S. Grant. He was one of the more prominent intellectuals in the movement and gave several speeches in England and Ireland. He also later met several prominent Irish nationalists during his time there, but since this is not a global course, we are not going to touch upon these meetings. Now let's talk about William Lloyd Garrison. So he was the founder of the American Anti-Slavery Society. He began his life as a newspaper editor and was one of the last supporters of the now dying Federalist Party. He was a journalist and abolitionist. Unlike many other thinkers, especially unlike Abraham Lincoln, who we're going to talk about a little bit later, he was very anti-Constitution on account of the fact that it was a pro-slavery document. In fact, he would blast the Constitution several times in his publication, The Liberator. Another interesting side note about William Lloyd Garrison is that unlike Abraham Lincoln, who we are going to discuss later, he was actually somewhat anti-union, not anti-union army, but he actually was in favor of slave states and free states, eventually becoming separate countries. However, he later put this idea more or less on the side during the Civil War and would later go on to be a supporter of Lincoln, despite his own more pacifist tendencies. Now, Harriet Beecher Stowe, she was an abolitionist and author, and is famous for her anti-slavery novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, let's talk about the central divide. So like any other movement for societal reform, abolitionists were divided between two impulses: moral reform and legislation. Moral reform refers in this case to changing the hearts and minds of the public. It takes a lot longer to accomplish something like this, right? Because you're trying to change individual opinions, and you're usually fighting other forces and influences that are trying to keep those opinions the same or change them in a different direction entirely. However, the one benefit is if you can actually bring about a moral reform in society, the changes that you eventually accomplish will tend to be more permanent, because there will not be as concentrated of a movement to overthrow these changes, because most of the public has come to accept these changes as necessary and ethical. On the opposite side of the coin is legislation, forming laws to amend the issue. In this case, we're talking about slavery. Now, the benefit is it's faster to provide relief to the suffering, right? Changing hearts and minds takes time. A lot less time is required to write a bill, get a law passed. So because of this, if your goal is to get relief to the oppressed sooner, then your reaction might be to handle legislation. Let's get the laws, let's make the practice illegal first, and then work on changing hearts and minds later. The only downside to this is that it's less secure. If most of the public is not on board, or a large chunk of the public is not on board, you're going to be stuck with a constant situation where whatever gains you've made are at threat of being overturned by movements held by a very large chunk of the country. So there's not a perfect answer to this. But the abolitionist movement struggled with this, and we're going to see the suffragist movement, we're going to see the civil rights movement, we're going to see almost every other movement after this is going to struggle with the same kind of issue. How do we go about bringing about the societal change that we think needs to occur? Now, one last note before we move on from this topic is the Underground Railroad. So the Underground Railroad referred to a network of abolitionists who hid slaves fleeing toward freedom. So sometimes these slaves were headed north to Canada, which was free as per the abolition of slavery in the British Empire that occurred in the 1830s. So because of this, Canada was entirely free. Now, others were fleeing to the northern states. Now, many former slaves would work as conductors on the Underground Railroad, guiding these slaves to freedom. Now, the Underground Network was not an actual underground train network. America and Britain would not develop subway rail systems until much later in the century. However, it was rather a network of houses and other locations wherein fugitive slaves would be hidden. Now, one of the most famous of the conductors on this Underground Railroad was Harriet Tubman, who helped lead hundreds of slaves to freedom and would later go on to work as a spy for the Union Army during the Civil War. So I hope you all found this lesson interesting. There's going to be a set of questions connected with this lecture. Please answer those for the homework tonight, as you were already informed. Hopefully, you found this informative, and we will discuss the topic further tomorrow.